Jason Newsted left Metallica on very bad terms after years of mistreatment. In this video, we'll be looking at why the other members treated Jason the way they did and how that contributed to his unfortunate exit from the band. Long before Jason even auditioned for Metallica, he was already a huge fan of theirs. Jason idolized James especially, but James was self-aware enough to know that he was a flawed human being who was not at all worthy of idolization. He felt uncomfortable being worshipped and thought if he messed with Jason long and hard enough, he could shake the fanboy out of him. That didn't work, and Jason ended up getting hurt the most by the bandmate he respected the most. The grief that James had over Cliff's death also manifested itself as antagonism towards Jason. Accepting Jason as an equal bandmate and respected bass player would have felt to James as though he was moving on from Cliff too soon. In his own twisted way, he felt that by dishonoring Jason, he was honoring Cliff. When Cliff died, James didn't just lose a friend, he also lost his entire moral compass. Cliff never bought into the whole obnoxious hyper-macho rockstar image, so with the loss of Cliff and his positive influence, James leaned fully into the toxic part of late 80s thrash culture. This included constant hazing of new members as initiation, and bandmates treating each other like dirt just to show how much of an alpha male they were. Jason was bullied musically as well, and this was made clear to the world upon the release of And Justice for All. The bass parts Jason recorded were turned down to the point they were almost inaudible. Metallica initially tried to give technical justifications, such as claiming James's mid-scooped guitar sound made the bass less necessary, or that the songs were intentionally made to sound jarring and cold to fit the cynical themes of the album. Even Jason said that his bass lines were following the guitar too much and muddying up the mix, which is why they were excluded. But in fan remixes, you can hear that this wasn't the case, and Jason was just being humble to a fault. From James's perspective, adding Jason's bass lines would have required him to acknowledge that Cliff was no longer around as his bass player, bandmate, and friend. He was psychologically not ready to do that, as he was not processing his grief well, so he continued treating Jason as if he wasn't a full member of the band. Lars's motivations for turning the bass down were slightly different. He wanted his drum parts to take center stage in this album, as opposed to merely being part of the rhythm section. This is not an unusual approach to production, especially in metal, but Lars wanted his drums to truly be at the sonic forefront of the album. He claims he didn't turn down the bass as much as turn up his drums and everything else, but producers who worked on the record have said otherwise. Metallica was also increasingly treating him as a mere hired hand, and his creative musical contributions were constantly turned down. As an artist, he had to channel his creative energy somewhere, so he started a side project, Echobrain. In the year 2000, Echobrain tried to record professional demos, but James and Lars didn't approve. James said that when someone does a side project, it takes away from the strength of Metallica. That was him speaking as a musician. At an emotional level, he was being overly possessive. Wanting Jason to stay with him and Metallica and never make music with anyone else was James's way of showing love and affinity, but this felt smothering to Jason. Lars's concerns with Echobrain were more business-centric. He felt it would be bad for the Metallica brand and image if the bass player of Metallica was anything other than the bass player of Metallica. This was it for Jason. He endured years of personal and professional disrespect, but the final straw was when he wasn't allowed to do what he was born to do, create music. Metallica had different reactions between members to Jason's exit. James, who was already going through addiction and a slew of other personal issues at the time, had a breakdown. Jason leaving was not the primary cause, but could have very well been a catalyzing factor. Lars went on full damage control mode. Being as business-minded as he wasn't concerned as much about the loss of a bandmate as much as the future of the Metallica band and business. Both James and Lars did try to give Jason Newsted the space and respect he deserved as an ex-bandmate, though, unlike how they went around bad-mouthing and mocking Dave Mustaine publicly when Dave was fired from Metallica. James even said that he would like for Jason to truly move on from Metallica and get on with his own career, instead of wallowing in resentment for decades like Dave. The Metallica member who felt the least guilt about Jason leaving was probably Kirk, because he didn't have much to be guilty about in the first place. He never abused Jason the same way James and Lars did. The closest thing to hazing he did was tricking Jason into eating wasabi by telling him it was mint ice cream. but that was more like playful schoolyard shenanigans compared to the kind of psychological torture that James and Lars were putting Jason through. Fans have asked why Kirk never stood up for Jason, but it's possible that Kirk was too innocent to even know that it was that serious. James and Lars seemed to be enjoying themselves, and Jason was hardy enough to take all they threw at him, so perhaps Kirk thought all three of his bandmates were equally having fun. Kirk was also the only bandmate who didn't have issues with Jason being in Echobrain, and even helped them record some demos before the issue blew up. He was the only one who actually treated Jason with respect as a bandmate and with love as a friend. This is why on Jason's final award show with Metallica in 2000, Kirk was seen on stage hugging Jason while James and Lars were acting nonchalant and barely acknowledging him. If Kirk was not in Metallica when Jason joined, Jason would have probably quit after just 4 years instead of 14 years. By the time Metallica got around to finding a new bass player, they were already acknowledging their mistakes and going through group therapy. They learned from their mistakes with Jason, they were finally processing the grief over Cliff's death and addressing an endless stream of other issues that had accumulated over the decades. Robert Trujillo was hired after being the standout in the auditions, and they made it clear to him and to themselves from the start that he was going to be treated and respected as a full member of Metallica and not just be a hired hand. They never hazed him or cut his bass lines out of an album, and Robert is now Metallica's longest-serving bassist. Looking back, the way Metallica treats a bass player is not an indictment on that specific bass player, but rather a reflection of where the band is emotionally. Robert was treated better than Jason not necessarily because he was a better fit, but because Metallica finally confronted their demons and learned how to let someone into their family again.